Come and discover Portugal with us. Please like, subscribe, and leave your comment. Your support and opinions are very important to us. Thank you. The Romanesque Church of São Pedro de Ratos is located in the parish of Ratos in the municipality of Póvoa de Varzim. Tradition suggests there was a Paleo-Christian shrine here dedicated to Saint Peter, a disciple of Saint James who was ordained by the latter as the first bishop of Braga. Legend has it that Saint Peter was persecuted for converting Roman believers to the Christian faith and was ordered to be killed by the father of a pagan princess. He took refuge in Ratos and was beheaded there. In the 9th century, his body was discovered by Saint Felix the Hermit, giving rise to the Church of Saint Peter of Ratos, where he was buried until 1552, when his body was transferred to a tomb in the Braga Cathedral. These events, like the character of Saint Peter of Ratos, are today considered purely fictional, created from the 16th century onwards in an attempt to reinforce the importance and historical legitimacy of the Diocese of Braga. The excavations carried out here confirm the existence of an older temple built between the 9th and 10th centuries prior to the creation of the County of Portugal, whose dimensions were much smaller than those of the current church. In the Museum of the Romanesque Church of São Pedro de Ratos we can see various architectural and sculptural elements that belong to this pre-Romanesque building. These include a reused Roman funerary stele, a funerary stele decorated with a cross and spirals, fragments of liturgical separation barriers, and a columned capital. Some pieces from the 12th century reconstruction were also found, such as a curious atlas that supported a column and a beak-head arch-voussoir decorated with a zoomorphic figure. Around 1100, on the orders of Count Henry and Countess Teresa, work began on rebuilding the church, which was then handed over to Benedictine monks from the Cluny community. These monks began a thorough remodeling of the building from 1120-1130, with the most important phase of its construction beginning in 1150, during the reign of King Afonso I of Portugal, and being completed in the mid-13th century. The Order of Cluny only had 3 monasteries in Portugal: Ratos, Vimieiro in Braga, and Santa Justa in Coimbra. They arrived in Portugal at the end of the 11th century when Count Henry of Portugal, who was the great-nephew of Hugh, Abbot of Cluny, was in charge of the County of Portugal. In France, this order built the largest and most important Romanesque church in the country, the Cluny Abbey, which grew into the largest temple in Christendom in the Middle Ages, becoming a center for architectural, artistic, and decorative references. The confirmation of the donation of the Church of São Pedro de Ratos to the monks of Cluny by King Afonso I in 1145, when João Peculiar was Archbishop of Braga, was an important moment in the history of this church. 2 sculptures inside, now on display on the church's museum center, have been identified as representations of João Peculiar with his vestments, mitre and bishop's crozier, and Afonso I of Portugal with the royal crown and sword in hand, making it the oldest representation of Portugal's first king. Over the centuries, this church has undergone several alterations, including the construction of a choir loft, as well as the decoration of its interior with mural paintings, tile panels, and gilded altarpieces. None of these elements are visible in this church today, as they were removed during a restoration campaign carried out by the Directorate General for National Buildings and Monuments, DGEMN, between the 1930s and the 1940s. These interventions were carried out under the direction of architect Rogério de Azevedo, in keeping with the prevailing concept at the time, which aimed to strip medieval buildings of all elements added later. The objective was to restore these monuments, seen as symbols of the founding period of the Portuguese nation, to the supposed purity and simplicity they possessed at the time of their construction. The chancel was completely rebuilt, partly using some of the original structural and decorative elements, which are marked with ochre-colored circles so that they can be distinguished from the 20th century editions. On the outside, the bell tower on the north side of the transept was demolished, along with the sacristy adjoining the apse and the rectangular window on the facade, which was replaced by the rose window we see today. Inside, a crossvault that existed in the right side nave was removed, as well as the plasterwork and mural paintings of some of the arches, the tiles in the apses and the Baroque altarpieces. Some of these removed elements have since been taken to other places where they can still be seen today, such as the Chapel of Senhor da Praça and the Chapel of Santo António, both located in Hatch. It should be noted that, at the time of the DGEMN works, the church of São Pedro de Hatch was in considerable disrepair, so this restoration made a decisive contribution to the temple's survival to this day. However, the intervention criteria were radically different from those that would have been followed in more recent decades, in which the elements added from the 16th century onwards would have been preserved. Unlike other architectural and artistic styles, the Romanesque is usually characterized by the profusion of symbolic elements carved into the capitals, archivolts, and tympanums of its portals. Medieval artists were inspired by nature, the uses and customs of the time, Christian religious allegories, and pagan traditions, which survived and coexisted with the established religion. The population that attended churches during the Middle Ages was almost entirely illiterate, with the exception of a few noblemen. Sculpture and painting were, therefore, a fundamental pillar in the evangelization process. The main portal of the Church of São Pedro de Hatch is a good example of this. It has 10 columns supporting 5 archivolts. The arches are slightly pointed, something that is particularly visible in the first archivolt. On the left side of the portal, 2 of the capitals depict a pair of birds devouring human figures by their feet, a representation that may be linked to the theme of the punishment of sinners. Another capital features a badly eroded representation of 2 quadruped animals that are difficult to identify and which share a single head that appears on the corner of the capital. The central capital depicts the figure of a bishop holding a crozier with his left hand, an object that symbolizes episcopal power and is based on the staffs used by shepherds for millennia. The next capital depicts a human head and a serpent biting something at the base of the capital. The serpent, a figure associated with Satan, evokes temptation and original sin. The modillion depicts 2 birds drinking from a chalice, a possible symbol of redemption associated with the chalice of the Eucharist. Under the second archivolt is a representation of an angel or winged man, a symbol of Saint Matthew. Under the first archivolt is a representation of an ox, symbol of Saint Luke. These representations symbolize two of the four evangelists who form a part of the so-called Tetramorph, derived from the union of the four creatures mentioned in the book of Ezekiel. In the center of the tympanum is the figure of Christ seated, with a halo or glory around his head. It is inscribed inside a mandola, an oval-shaped aureole whose name derives from the Italian word for almond. To the left and right of Christ are the sun and moon, symbols of eternity, and markers of God as the first and the last, the Alpha and Omega. Flanking Christ are Saint Peter and Saint Paul. Under the apostles' feet are two naked figures who represent Judas, Christ's betrayer, and Arius, founder of Arianism at the end of the 3rd century, which was seen as a heretical doctrine that considered Jesus to be the Son of God and not God himself. Under the tympanum is a representation of two intertwined serpents with canid heads, biting each other's tails, marking a threshold from which the faithful pass from the impure domain of the outside world into the domain of the sacred inside the church. The innermost archivolt is decorated with figures of angels holding a thurible, also known as an incense burner, in one hand and the shaft of a cross in the other, instruments that are part of the liturgy. The next archivolt shows 7 apostles, with Paul, Andrew, John and Thomas being named. This set may be completed by the representation of the remaining 5 apostles in the arch of the first section inside the church, which we'll see later. On the right side of the portal there is another representation of a pair of birds drinking from a chalice in the modillion under the tympanum, which is very similar to the one on the left. The first capital once again shows 2 birds devouring a human figure by the feet, a theme similar to that represented in 2 capitals on the left side of the portal. The next capital shows a human head and a snake that seems to be biting something at the base of this element. The same decoration also appears on one of the capitals on the left-hand side that we saw earlier. The capital in the center depicts a mermaid holding her tail in her left hand and a fish in her right hand. These mythical creatures are associated with temptation, leading men of faith astray into sin. The next capital shows a figure of a man between 2 birds, which has also been interpreted as a man holding 2 birds by the neck. The final capital is decorated with phytomorphic motifs. Under the first archivolt is a lion, symbolizing the apostle Saint Mark. Next to it, under the second archivolt, there was a representation of an eagle, symbolizing Saint John. This portal is an important testimony to the Burgundian and Cluniac influence in Portugal during the 12th century, both in its design and in the iconography it contains. The north-facing facade of the church has another portal that opens onto the nave and is made up of 2 round archivolts with decorated friezes. According to some researchers, this corresponds to the first construction phase of the current building in the mid-12th century. Its design reveals the simplicity of the means available at that time in a rural environment. The two capitals on the left and one on the right are decorated with plant motifs, revealing the simplicity of the artistic program of this portal when compared, for instance, with the main one. The second capital on the right contains representations of two birds, a leaf, and a fruit, and it has been suggested that these may be birds feeding. The corbels supporting the tympanum are decorated with a volute. The innermost archivolt is divided into two sections. The lower one is decorated with ornaments in the shape of the head of a horseshoe nail, and the upper one with X-shaped or star-shaped motifs. The same X motif decorates the outer section of the second archivolt. The tympanum of this portal is plain without any carved elements, reinforcing the idea of the frugality of its decoration. The transept of the Church of São Pedro de Ratos was also one of the first parts of the monument to be built, given its layout, structure and height. The blind arcades that adorn the exterior and interior of the apse, the decoration of the bases and capitals of the embedded columns, and the corbels that support the eaves of the roof can be dated to the middle to third quarter of the 12th century. It's important to emphasize that, as mentioned above, the chancel underwent extensive reconstruction in the 1940s, in which original elements were used but others of contemporary make were added. The decoration of the medieval modillions is very rich, including depictions of a couple holding hands, an allusion to marriage, a man blowing a horn, a hunting scene, a figure bound by the feet, an image of punishment, and a seated figure that bears similarities to others found on corbels in Portuguese Romanesque churches and which represent an onanist, symbolizing the sin of lust. On other modillions we can find the representation of a quadruped animal, possibly an ape, a wine barrel, this was a wine-producing region, an animal devouring a human figure by the feet, theme of punishment for sins committed, and the figuration of an animal that appears to be a horse. At the back of the Church of São Pedro de Ratos, next to the bell tower, we can see a set of medieval granite chest tombs. The exterior of the transepts and apses of the church also have several interesting decorative elements. The window of the north transept, with a round arch decorated with a serrated motif, has two sculpted capitals. The one on the left depicts the figure of a bishop with a crozier, and the one on the right a set of leaves and volutes. Outside the chancel are blind arcades decorated with checkered motifs. The columns are spiral-shaped, some of which have flowers on their shafts. The capitals are decorated with plant and zoomorphic motifs. One of the capitals has an elaborate decoration in the form of braided ribbons. The larger capitals, corresponding to the tallest columns, are finely carved with volutes and voluminous leaves. On the south facade of the church, on the wall of the transept arm, there is another side portal whose construction dates back to the last quarter of the 12th century. Its more elaborate decoration clearly reveals a different phase in the building of this temple. This is one of several anomalies in the planimetry of this monument, as its position is not centered in relation to the width of the transept, as is the case with the north side portal, and it therefore does not face it. This portal originally gave access to the monastic area, where there was a cloister that disappeared after the 16th century, when the monastery was extinguished and the temple handed over to the Order of Christ as a commandery. At the top of the portal, on the left-hand side of the tympanum, there's a representation of an animal holding a book, which has most often been identified as a lion, symbol of St. Mark, while others claim it is an eagle, symbol of St. John. On the opposite side, also under the second archivolt, there is the figure of an angel or winged man holding the Gospel, a symbol that represents the evangelist St. Matthew. The tympanum contains a representation of the Agnus Dei, the Lamb of God, surmounted by a Greek cross. This symbol represents Jesus Christ as the Savior of humanity, having been sacrificed to atone for the original sin. The first archivolt above the tympanum is decorated with a beautiful polylobe motif that reveals Oriental influences brought to Portugal through Islamic architecture. The next archivolt is divided into two sections, the inner one being rounded and emerging from the mouths of two creatures in the extremities, and the outer one decorated with lanceolate ornaments. The outermost archivolt is decorated with lanceolate elements, a leaf-shaped decoration that is characteristic of the Romanesque architecture of the Burgundy region in France. Under the tympanum we can see a bas-relief in the shape of a double ribbon, traversed by half-spheres, which emerges from the mouth of a creature, possibly a lion. In medieval art, the lion symbolizes the guardian of the threshold, who subdues evil. The outer capital on the left once again depicts two birds devouring a human figure by the feet, reinforcing the concept of the chastisement and punishment of sinners. The second capital depicts an animal surrounding a human head. The lower block of the left modillion of this portal is decorated with a plant motif in the shape of a palmette. Above this, the upper block, which supports the tympanum, is decorated with a version of the so-called Solomon's Knot, an apotropaic symbol of immemorial origins associated with protection against evil. The abacus above the columns on the left shows a representation of a double pearly ribbon, evoking the shape of snakes, coming out of the mouth of an undefined creature. The modillion under the tympanum on the right is decorated with plant motifs. The two capitals on the right side of the portal replicate the same decoration found on the capitals on the left. On both sides of the south portal, in the lower section, two Atlas animals are depicted, once again harking back to the medieval fantastic bestiary. The figure on the right depicts a lion devouring a creature with a human body and an animal head. Again, the lion as a guardian who eliminates evil, personified in a sinful and grotesque human. On the right-hand side of the portal are two medieval inscriptions from the 13th century. The first, located at the top and written in smaller characters, corresponds to the funerary inscription of a Lady Urraca. Just below, in larger characters, is the funerary inscription of Pedro Martins and his daughter, Lady Mayor. These inscriptions may correspond to honors paid to benefactors of the monastery. At some point after it was built, the tympanum of this portal suffered a fracture in its lower part, which meant that the corbels supporting it had to be altered. The corbel on the left is larger, supporting the section of the tympanum where it shows a vertical fracture, which is why it is decorated differently to the one on the right. The interior of the church of São Pedro de Ratos develops longitudinally and has 3 naves, the central one being the tallest and widest, divided into 4 bays of unequal size. This monument has several contradictions in its planimetry, which have led several experts to conclude that the original plan was far more ambitious than the one that was eventually realized. The facade walls, for example, are 2 meters thick and have 3 powerful buttresses. The north and south facades have 5 buttresses each. The south wall of the main nave also has 3 tall inlaid pillars. All these elements of structural reinforcement suggest that the original plan was to build diaphragm arches and stone vaulting, at least in the transept. In the end, the stone roofs were reserved only for the apses and transept arms, while the naves and crossing were covered with a roof supported by a wooden structure. The inside of the main portal is also decorated with a tympanum carved in bas-relief and 2 decorated archivolts. A small figure of an angel can be seen at the top of the inner tympanum. In the center is a representation of the Paschal Lamb, Christ's sacrificial symbol, flanked by 2 figures identified as Saint John the Baptist and the prophet Isaiah. Above the tympanum, the first archivolt is decorated with an incised motif in the form of lozenges. In the center of the second archivolt, a mask or grotesque is carved, from the mouth of which vine stems emerge in both directions, producing a beautiful effect. Throughout this church, there are elements that indicate changes made to the original design of the building. The main portal thus appears off-center in relation to the width of the facade. The nave on the left is also less wide than the nave on the right. The arches of the first 2 bays on the left are different from those in the rest of the temple, both being decorated with sculpted elements. The arch on the first bay is slightly pointed and depicts 6 angels and 5 apostles. These decorative elements are similar to those found on the main portal. Some researchers have hypothesized that these elements were planned to form part of a larger portal and were later reused when it was reduced from the original plan. The arch on the second bay is rounded and is made up of voussoirs of different sizes on the outer arch, decorated with figurative and geometric motifs. The figurative motifs include depictions of lions, pairs of birds with one head, birds with animal heads, creatures devouring human figures, and angels. The bases of the pillars that support these arches also feature representations of creatures or beasts, and it is possible that they were also intended for the main portal that was initially planned. In Romanesque art, no distinction is made between creatures from the real world, such as bovids, caprids, suids, and felines, and those from the imagination and mythology, mermaids, harpies, serpents with human heads, and griffins, for example. This cohabitation between the real and the fantastic would be a way of bringing together the sacred and the profane, as well as earthly fears and the terrors of the mind, associating them with the notion of sin and the warding off of evil by the Christian faith. The presence of sculptural elements illustrating vices and virtues, as well as celestial and infernal visions, is not extinguished in the portals, the modillions, or the columns and colonnettes on the outside. Throughout the naves and apses inside the church of São Pedro de Ratos, we can see dozens of capitals decorated with motifs ranging from simple plant shapes to complex figurative depictions. Many of these representations are a fascinating challenge for those who, several centuries after the design and construction of this temple, are trying to decipher what they symbolize. Unraveling the meaning of these enigmatic shapes and figures is an exercise that requires knowledge of their historical and artistic context, but one that is unlikely to offer definitive and incontestable answers. The capitals, decorated with geometric and/or plant elements, include pendant spheres, volutes and spearheads, triple spiral volutes and rosettes, or mixtures of leaves with volutes. Other capitals from this family include representations of leaves with well-marked veins, topped by abacuses decorated with a checkered motif and with the astragalus, rounded frame at the bottom of the capital, in the shape of a rope. The range of capitals decorated with figurative elements include this one, in which pearly and plated ribbons emerge from the mouth of a creature situated at the bottom, possibly a feline. This capital features two pairs of birds devouring human figures by their feet, a motif also present in the main and south portals. Between the birds is a human figure with his hands on his head, perhaps in a ritual pose. The complex decoration of this capital includes 4 creatures, over which the heads of 6 men appear. In the corners there are hanging human figures, an image of punishment or sacrifice, and the abacus depicts a serpent, a symbol of evil. This capital shows a man with his arms crossed, which appear to be being bitten by 2 creatures. It has been suggested that this may be a representation of the biblical episode of Daniel in the lion's den, where the animals would be licking his hands rather than biting them. Some capitals repeat the format previously seen on the outside of the temple, in which pairs of animals share a single head at the angles, and may include lions, apes, and birds. Horn or oliphant players reappear, instruments that were used in hunting and war. There are also mixtures of figurative elements, volutes, with human and animal imagery, in this case owls. The theme of punishment, materialized in human figures being devoured by animals, is omnipresent. The combination of plant, geometric, and figurative elements produces surprising effects. On another capital, we see two animal heads, perhaps felines, sneaking through the vegetation, possibly symbolizing danger. A set of plated and pearl ribbons surround ovoid objects on another capital, possibly pine cones or even eggs. If the geometric and plant decorations correspond to a Visigothic tradition, the animal and human figurations are the result of the intervention of the Benedictine monks in Portugal, which the historian José Matos called the Portuguese Benedictine school. The Spanish art historian Josep Gudiol Ricart said the capitals of Rates, with mermaids, quadrupeds and a good variety of animal and plant themes, on the portals and in the interior, are some of the soundest and most accomplished in Portuguese art. Like the main portal, the interior of the south portal also has a number of decorative elements that deserve our attention. On the right is a corbel whose inner face is carved in the shape of a lion's head. Again, this feline appears associated with the temple's entrances as the guardian of the boundary between the inside and outside. The lintel above the door is decorated with a bas-relief depicting two intertwined serpents biting each other's tails, a similar motif to that found under the tympanum of the main portal. Finally, the inner archivolt is decorated with a set of incised lozenges, a more simplistic decoration. In the nave on the south side, there was a Gothic cross vault, possibly dating from the 13th century, which covered the last section, having been demolished during the aforementioned 1940 intervention. On an ashlar inside the church there is an inscription, partially mutilated, which may reveal the name of the master stonemason responsible for this Gothic intervention, Master Pelagius. The arms of the transept are covered by pointed barrel vaults, and the apse chapels have barrel vaults ending in semidomes or half-domes. In the apses there are imposts in the middle and at the top of the walls, marking the transition to the vaults, decorated with a checkered motif. Various architectural elements of this church have been interpreted by historians as indicating its Cluniac inspiration. José Matos compared it to the church of Paray-le-Monial in France, namely in the following aspects. The cruciform pillars with columns attached to all four sides, the pointed barrel vaults in the apse, the arches surrounding the windows decorated with checkered motifs, and the buttresses at the corners of the transept and nave. Also notable are the influences of Galician models, not least because of their geographical and cultural proximity to this territory, which are visible in the planimetry, structure and decoration of this temple. Decorative motifs such as lions, open-winged birds, ox heads and seated human figures emanated from the cathedrals of Compostela and Tui from the middle of the 12th century and during the 13th century. In the north apse, the vault and decorative elements are very similar to what can be seen in the south apse, both of which are illuminated by a round arched window. The chancel is preceded by a pointed triumphal arch topped by a small oculus. The lower part has 11 blind arcades and is covered by a pointed barrel vault that ends in a semidome. The original semicircular barrel vault is thought to have collapsed during the 12th century as a result of possible design errors or an earthquake, and was replaced by another with an ogival profile. The Church of São Pedro de Rates has been classified as a national monument since 1910, after which it underwent a major restoration and reconstruction campaign in the 1930s and 40s, organized by the GEMN. Throughout the remaining decades of the 20th century, it underwent occasional repairs and improvements, but its state of conservation is currently worrying, with deep erosion marks and plant growth on its exterior. Inside, the marks left by humidity and lichens are visible, deteriorating the walls and sculptural elements. It is therefore urgent to start the restoration work that has been promised by the Portuguese government since 2023. Thank you for discovering Portugal with us. If you liked the video, please click on the like button and subscribe to the channel to follow our new releases.